The wind carried a low whistle across the plains, threading through the brittle stalks of winter grass and rattling the warped boards of the old ranch house. Clay Harlow sat on the porch, boots propped on the railing, a chipped mug of coffee cooling in his hand. The sky stretched wide and endless above him, blue at noon, fading to amber and violet at dusk, then black velvet scattered with stars. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also a mirror of his life, vast, empty, and mercilessly quiet. Clay had been alone for 4 years now. The cattle still needed tending, the fences mending, and the barns kept in repair. But those tasks were mechanical movements of hands that no longer had anyone to share them with. His wife, Mara, had been the laughter in the house, the one who filled the silence with her humming, her chatter, even her scolding when he tracked mud across the kitchen floor. When fever carried her off one bitter winter, the house seemed to shrink into itself. The walls no longer held warmth. The rooms echoed with absence. He told himself work would keep him steady. Work had always been the thing he could rely on. The cattle didn't care about grief. They wanted feeding, watering, doctoring, and driving to market. The land didn't care either. It required plowing, sowing, and reaping. In those first months, after Mara passed, Clay let the routine consume him. He rose before dawn, drove himself hard, and collapsed at night too tired to think. But seasons came and went, and the loneliness only grew heavier. The men in town called him quiet, but not unfriendly. He'd ride in once or twice a month for supplies, maybe share a drink at the saloon, then head back out. People respected him hard. Worker, honest, steady. But nobody really knew him. They saw a rancher keeping to himself. They didn't see the empty chair across the supper table, the untouched place setting he still couldn't bring himself to put away. He had no children to soften the ache. He and Mara had tried, prayed, and waited, but fate had given them only each other. Some nights Clay lay awake listening to the coyotes yipping on the ridge and thought maybe that was for the best. What kind of father could he be now, with his heart carved hollow? Better the child never came at all than to grow up in a house like this, quiet, bitter, with a man who didn't know how to smile anymore. The land itself became both his comfort and his curse. He loved it, the rolling hills that turned gold in autumn, the wildflowers that painted the meadows in spring, the sky so big it made a man feel small in the best and worst ways, but the very vastness of it mocked him. Every sunrise reminded him he was the only soul out here to see it. Every sunset reminded him that no one waited by the fire when he came back from the range. Sometimes, when loneliness pressed too hard, Clay talked to Mara as if she were still there. He'd sit on the porch with his coffee and murmur about the weather, the stubborn heifer that wouldn't take to the calf, the way the cottonwoods were bending under the wind. It wasn't madness, not exactly. It was habit. He pretended she was listening, smiling the way she used to, telling him not to fret so much. But when the words hung unanswered in the night air, the silence always felt louder for having been broken. Neighbors rode by once in a while, ranchers from over the ridge or drifters looking for a day's work. Clay offered them water, maybe a meal, but never asked them to stay. He didn't want company, not the kind that came and went. He wanted what he couldn't have back. And so he lived with the cattle, the land, and the ghosts. Still, there was a decency in him that never withered. Clay wasn't cruel or bitter by nature. He just carried sorrow the way he carried a saddle, heavy but familiar. It bent his shoulders, made his voice gravelly, but there remained a core of quiet gentleness under it. When he brushed down a horse, he did it slowly, tenderly, talking low to soothe the animal. When he came across an injured calf, he didn't hesitate to kneel in the mud and lift it into the wagon. His grief hadn't hardened him into stone. It had simply drained away the spark that once made him laugh, dream, and reach for another person's hand, and so the days dragged. Seasons turned, the herd grew or thinned, the grass browned, and greened again. Outwardly, Clay lived the life of any rancher in the West: grit, sweat, and silence. But beneath the surface, the truth was simpler, sharper. He was a man untethered, a man surviving more than living. Clay didn't know it then, but all that loneliness, all that emptiness, was leading him to a moment that would change everything. A dusty town, a backroom auction, and a woman whose first words to him would echo across the rest of his life. Please, just make it quick. The town of Red Hollow wasn't much to look at, just a strip of false front buildings slouched against the dusty street, a handful of wagons parked along the hitching posts, and a saloon that never closed its doors. Clay Harlow had ridden in with nothing on his mind but supplies. He needed flour, kerosene, salt, a coil of rope, and maybe a new bridle if he could find one. Worth the coin. That was all. He wasn't a man for lingering in town, and he wasn't a man for crowds. But that afternoon, something felt off the moment he stepped down from his horse. The usual rhythm of town was muted. Folks gathered in clusters, their voices low, eyes cast toward the back of a ramshackle building at the end of the street. The structure was half warehouse, half barn, its paint peeling in wide curls. Clay tied his horse, shouldered his way past the murmur, and found himself pulled along by curiosity. It wasn't until he stepped inside that he realized what kind of gathering it was. The air was thick with sweat, tobacco smoke, and the sour tang of whiskey. Men leaned against walls, perched on barrels, and crowded the edges of a makeshift platform. An auctioneer with a patchy beard stood at the front, his voice carrying through the space with a practiced rhythm. But instead of wagons, tools, or cattle, the lots being presented were smaller, sadder. A boy barely 12 offered up as labor for someone's farm. A girl who couldn't meet anyone's gaze, her hair unwashed and tangled. And then the woman looked half dead already. Thin to the point of frailty, her dress little more than rags hanging loose on her shoulders. Dirt smudged her skin, but it couldn't hide the bruises at her wrists. Her hair, once dark and perhaps beautiful, fell in uncombed strands over her face. And her eyes, Clay never forgot her eyes. They weren't wild or pleading like the others he'd seen before. They were hollow, like someone who had already made peace with her end. The auctioneer barked something about debts owed, about property forfeited, about how she was fit enough for kitchen work or whatever else a man might need. The crowd answered with jeers and laughter, voices thick with cruelty. Start the bidding at $5. The auctioneer called silence. The men smirked, some muttering about how she wasn't worth the trouble. One spat on the floor, another snickered that he wouldn't take her if they paid him. The auctioneer tried again. $2. Still nothing. A few heads shook. A few more laughs. Finally, the auctioneer, red-faced and irritated, slapped his hand against the podium. $1. Who'll give me a single dollar for her? It was then the woman's eyes lifted, just enough to catch Clay's, for a heartbeat. It was as if the noise of the room faded, leaving only the two of them suspended in silence. Her lips parted, dry and cracked, and she whispered barely audible. But he heard it. Please, just make it quick. The words landed heavy, heavier than any plea for help could have. She wasn't begging for rescue, wasn't asking for mercy. She was asking for an end, certain that whoever bought her would finish what life had already done to her. Clay's hand moved before his mind did. He reached into his pocket, fingers brushing the lone silver coin he always carried, a habit of. Meraz, a man should never walk with empty pockets, she used to say. He drew it out, lifted it into the air, and let it catch the dim lantern light. $1, he said, his voice steady. The auctioneer slammed his hand down at once. Sold. The crowd broke into chuckles and mutters. Some thought it a waste of money, some a joke, and some looked at Clay with quiet suspicion. But Clay didn't care. He had already stepped forward, meeting the woman's eyes again as the auctioneer shoved her toward him, up close. She was even smaller than she had looked from the back of the room. Her shoulders trembled under the weight of despair. She wouldn't meet his gaze now, only stared at the ground as though bracing herself. Clay placed the coin on the podium, took her arm gently, not with force, not with ownership, but as though guiding someone who had forgotten how to walk, and led her out into the daylight. Behind them, the room buzzed with cruel laughter. To the men inside, Clay was just another buyer, another man with a grim purpose. To the woman, he was one more set of hands in a long line of tormentors. But Clay knew differently. That single dollar had not bought him a servant, nor a companion, nor anything else those men assumed. That single dollar had bought her freedom, though she did not yet know it. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Too quiet. Clay sat tall in the saddle, reins loose in his hand, the woman riding beside him on the back of his spare horse. He had adjusted the stirrups for her, but she didn't seem to notice. She sat stiff, clutching the pommel, her eyes fixed on the ground as if afraid to look anywhere else. Every so often, the wind caught her hair and blew it across her face, but she didn't brush it back. Clay didn't push conversation. He wasn't a man for many words, and besides, he could feel her silence wasn't the same as his. His was the silence of habit, of solitude. Hers was the silence of someone who had been trained by pain, by fear, to keep her thoughts locked away. The sun sagged toward the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of red and orange. Coyotes yipped far off, the sound carrying over the dry plains. Clay glanced at her once, saw the way her shoulders hunched tighter at the noise, and said only, "Almost there." When they reached the ranch, the place looked even lonelier than usual. The barn loomed dark against the fading light, the corral empty, the house squat and weather-beaten. Clay swung down, tied off his horse, and waited as she dismounted. She wobbled, legs weak from the ride, but steadied herself before he could reach to help. Inside, the cabin was plain but clean. Clay struck a match, lit the lantern on the table, and set out a plate of bread and beans from the pot he'd left simmering earlier. The smell filled the room, simple but hearty. "Eat," he said. Nodding to the table. She stood just inside the door, eyes darting around like a cornered animal. Finally, she whispered hoarsely, "What do you want me to do first?" Clay frowned. "Eat," he repeated. Her lips tightened, as though bracing for a blow. She crept toward the table, sat slowly, and stared at the food as if it were a trick. Finally, with trembling hands, she lifted a piece of bread and took the smallest bite, chewing like she expected someone to rip it from her mouth. Clay turned away to give her space, busying himself with stoking the fire. He could feel her eyes on his back, measuring him, waiting. When she finally spoke again, her voice cracked with exhaustion. "Please, just make it quick." The words froze him. He didn't turn around right away, staring into the flames as if they might tell him how to answer. "Make what quick?" He asked at last, though he already knew. "You paid for me," she whispered, staring at her hands. "I know what comes next. Just don't drag it out." Clay closed his eyes for a long moment. The ache in his chest was sharper than any grief he'd felt in years. Not because of the insult, that she thought him capable of cruelty, but because he could see, plain as day, how many times she must have been proven right about other men before him. He turned, slow and deliberate, and met her hollow gaze. "I didn't pay for you," he said softly. "I paid for your freedom." She blinked, confusion flickering across her face before disbelief smothered it. She shook her head. "Don't lie. Men don't spend money on women just to—" "I do," Clay cut in, his voice firm now. "You won't lift a finger here unless you choose to. You'll eat, rest, and when you're strong enough, you can decide where to go." "That's the truth," Her mouth opened, then closed again. Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. She looked down at the bread in her hands, as if trying to weigh the truth in its texture. The silence stretched. Finally, she whispered, "Why?" Clay didn't have an answer neat enough to give. He thought of Mara, of how she had always said, "Kindness costs less than cruelty." He thought of the loneliness that had eaten him alive these last 4 years. And he thought of how, when she'd whispered, "Make it quick," something inside him had refused to let her be right about the world, because no one should have to beg for the end, he said quietly. That broke something in her. Not in a loud way, no sobs, no collapse, but in a subtle tremor that ran through her shoulders, a sharp breath she tried to disguise, a flicker in her eyes that wasn't disbelief anymore, but the faintest glimmer of something else. Something like doubt, something like hope. She didn't thank him, not yet. She didn't trust him, not yet. But when she picked up the spoon and ate another bite of beans, this time without shaking, Clay took it as enough. For now. The dollar itself was unremarkable, a scuffed silver coin worn smooth around the edges, the kind of currency that passed through countless hands without notice. Yet for Clay, it felt heavier than gold. That morning, before he rode into town, he had slipped it into his pocket like always. It was a habit left over from Mara, his wife. She had believed in small tokens, little anchors that tethered a man to something beyond himself. A coin for the road, a prayer for the journey, she used to say with a teasing smile, dropping one into his palm before he rode out. After her passing, the habit stuck. The coin had become more than money. It was a keepsake, a ritual, a reminder that someone had once thought of him every time he left the ranch. When Clay set that coin down on the auctioneer's podium, the crowd had seen nothing more than a cheap purchase. $1 for a worn-out woman no one else wanted. They laughed at the absurdity, muttered about waste, and shook their heads at the foolish rancher. To them, Clay's gesture was just another transaction in a backroom built for cruelty. But Clay knew better. He hadn't bought her. He had bought a chance for her to step out of that room alive, a chance for him to act against the rot he saw spreading in the world. That single dollar to him was not a purchase but a protest. A quiet refusal to be like the others. As the days passed, though, the weight of that choice began to press on him in new ways. He caught the look in her eyes whenever he entered the room. Suspicion, guardedness, disbelief. She slept lightly, the kind of restless half-sleep of someone who expected to be dragged awake by rough hands. Sometimes Clay heard her stir in the night, footsteps soft across the floor as though she were debating slipping out the door and vanishing into the dark. Each time she returned to her cot, curling up small, as if trying to disappear. Clay couldn't blame her. From her perspective, what sense did it make? Men didn't hand over money without expecting something back. Men didn't say, "You're free," and mean it. One evening, as he cleaned his rifle by the fire, she finally spoke. Her voice was quiet but sharp, like the edge of broken glass. "You could have left me there. Why waste a coin?" Clay set the rag down, looked into the flames, and considered his words. "Wasn't a waste," he said simply, her hands clenched in her lap. $1 may not mean much to you, but it means you own me now. That's how it works." Clay turned his head then, meeting her gaze fully. "Not to me." She held his eyes a moment longer, searching for the trap, for the lie. When she found none, she scoffed softly, bitterly. Men don't spend money for nothing. He almost told her about Mara then, about how his wife had taught him that kindness could change a person's world. But the memory was too raw, and besides, he doubted a stranger's story would be enough to sway her. Instead, he just said, "Maybe I ain't like other men." That silenced her. She looked away, shoulders tense, as though she couldn't bear the thought that he might be telling the truth. The next morning, she surprised him. When he came in from the barn, he found the table cleared, the dishes washed. She stood by the basin, drying her hands with a rag, her posture stiff but determined. "You said I don't have to work," she said without turning around. "But I can't just sit. I need to do something." Clay watched her for a long moment, then nodded. "Do what you need." It was a small thing, but to him, it was proof the first crack in the wall she had built around herself. She wasn't ready to trust, but she was beginning to test the edges of his promise, to see if it held. That night, as he lay in bed, Clay pulled the empty space in his pocket where the coin had always rested. It was gone, left behind in that dim auction room, but he didn't feel its absence as a loss. Instead, he realized something he hadn't dared to believe in years. For the first time since Mara's death, he had given a part of himself away, not in grief, but in hope. The coin had bought more than freedom. It had bought a fragile, unspoken chance for two broken lives to begin stitching themselves together. The first test came sooner than either of them expected. 3 days after the auction, Clay saddled up before dawn, planning to ride fence lines. The woman, he still didn't know her name, for she hadn't offered it, was sitting on the porch. Steps, arms wrapped around her knees, staring out at the horizon. She hadn't asked to come inside his room, hadn't touched his belongings, hadn't done more than eat, wash, and sit in silence. But that morning, something in her posture was different, stiff, wary, almost listening for trouble. And trouble came. By mid-morning, riders appeared on the ridge. 3 men, dust rising in their wake, silhouettes sharp against the rising sun. Clay spotted them before they spotted him, but once they saw his ranch, they veered straight toward it. He rode back hard, instincts tight in his chest. The woman saw them too. She stood as they approached, her body trembling so hard Clay thought she might collapse. "They've come," she whispered, voice hoarse. "Who?" Clay asked. "Men from the auction. Debt collectors. Or worse." Her hands gripped the porch rail like she meant to tear it off. "They'll take me back. You can't stop them." Clay swung down from his horse, his jaw set. "Watch me." The riders slowed as they neared the yard, boots dangling loose from stirrups, rifles slung casually but ready. The leader, a thick-set man with a scar bisecting his cheek, gave Clay a grin that never reached his eyes. "Morning," he drawled. "We heard you picked yourself up a piece at the sale the other day. Thought we'd come collect what's ours." Clay stepped forward, planting himself between them and the porch. His voice was calm but steady as iron. "She's not yours." The man's grin faltered. "Now hold on. She was property of the auction. Belonged to us until the debts were cleared. You might have thrown down a coin, but that don't buy her freedom. Just buys her from one set of hands to another. That's how it works." Clay didn't flinch. "Not here, it doesn't." The men shifted in their saddles, uneasy. The woman on the porch let out a sharp breath, half a sob, half a laugh of disbelief. Clay's words sounded like madness to her, but he didn't waver. The scarred man leaned forward in his saddle. "Listen, rancher, we don't want trouble. Hand her over and we'll forget this little misunderstanding. Otherwise—" He tapped the rifle at his side, the sound of metal on wood heavy in the morning air. Clay's hand drifted to the butt of his own rifle, slung across his back. His heart thudded hard, but his voice was low and sure. "You'll ride off my land or you'll ride off in pine boxes. Your choice." Silence stretched between them, taut as a drawn bowstring. The wind rattled the dry grass. The woman's breath caught audibly behind him. For a moment, Clay thought blood would be spilled. He saw the men weighing the odds, 3 against 1, but with no easy way to take him down before he dropped 1 or 2 of them. Finally, the scarred man spat into the dirt and jerked his reins. "Wasn't worth the trouble anyway," he muttered. "She's broken. Won't last the winter." They turned, slow at first, then faster, until dust swallowed them on the horizon. Clay stood motionless, watching until the last trace of them vanished. Only then did he exhale, shoulders loosening. He turned toward the porch. The woman was still, gripping the railing, knuckles white, eyes wide with shock. She shook her head as if she couldn't believe what she'd just seen. Why? She whispered again, the same question she'd asked before. Clay wiped his brow with his sleeve. Because I meant what I said. You're free. No man's taking you back. Tears welled in her eyes this time, though she blinked them back fiercely, as if refusing to let herself be so weak in front of him. You'd risk your life for me, a stranger, Clay nodded once. I'd risk it for anyone who needed it. But you're under my roof now. That makes it my responsibility. Her lips trembled, caught between gratitude and terror. She turned away, sat heavily back on the steps, and pressed her hands over her face. The sobs that broke free were muffled, ragged, and uncontrollable. Clay didn't move to comfort her. He knew better than to crowd someone who'd been handled rough all her life. Instead, he walked back to the fence, leaned against a post, and let her cry. The sound raw and painful in the open air. When she finally quieted, she whispered something into her hands too soft for him to hear. But Clay didn't need to hear it. For the first time, she'd let the dam break. For the first time, she believed, maybe just a little, that his unthinkable choice was real, and that it meant she still had a chance at life. The ranch had always been a quiet place, but now the silence had a different weight. Before, it had been Clay's burden alone, the endless hush of an empty house, the wind whispering through the plains like a reminder of what he'd lost. But with her there, the silence seemed to breathe differently. Not lighter, not yet, but no longer entirely empty. At first, the woman couldn't stand it. She sat on the porch or in the corner of the cabin, shoulders tight, eyes flicking toward every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the rafters. At night, she startled at the coyotes calling from the ridge, clutching the blanket around her as though it were armor. Clay noticed how she flinched whenever he entered a room unexpectedly, how she kept her back to the wall so no one could approach from behind. She was like a deer cornered in a snare, tensed for pain, even when none came. Clay didn't press her. He didn't fill the quiet with needless talk, nor did he leave her stranded in it. He let her be. When he cooked, he set 2 plates on the table and said nothing if she chose not to eat until after he'd left the room. When he tended to the cattle, he left the barn doors open so she could watch from a safe distance if she wanted. He treated her the way he treated spooked horses, with patience, gentleness, and spaced out slowly, almost imperceptibly. Something shifted. It started the morning she followed him to the barn. She didn't speak, didn't step inside, but stood near the doorway as he brushed down one of the maraes. The rhythmic strokes of the brush, the soft snorts of the animal, the low hum of Clay's voice as he murmured to the horse, it seemed to ease her. She stayed until he finished, then slipped away without a word. The next day, she lingered longer. A few days later, she asked, barely above a whisper, "What's her name?" Clay told her June, a stubborn mare he'd raised since birth. The woman said nothing more, but the question itself was a crack in the silence, proof she was beginning to engage with the world again. Her fear of the nights was harder to shake. More than once, Clay woke to the faint sound of muffled cries. He never approached, never called out, just stoked the fire, let its warmth spread, and left the door to his room ajar so she'd know he wasn't far. Eventually, the cries lessened. Eventually, she began to sleep through the coyotes' calls, her breathing deep and steady on the other side of the thin wall. The silence that had once been suffocating for her began, slowly, to heal. Out on the ranch, the quiet wasn't hostile. It was alive. The wind carried the rustle of grass, the groan of branches, the distant lowing of cattle. The land itself seemed to murmur, "You're safe here. You're still alive. Clay noticed her. Shoulders loosened bit by bit. She walked the yard without constantly glancing over her shoulder. She stood straighter, not hunched as though protecting herself from unseen blows. And just once he caught her humming under her breath while hanging laundry on the line. The sound was faint, cut off the moment she realized he'd heard, but it was there. One evening, as the sun bled orange across the plains, Clay brought 2 mugs of coffee to the porch. He set one beside her without a word and sat down. They drank, in silence, watching the light fade. After a long while, she spoke, her voice uncertain but clear. "It's so quiet out here." Clay nodded. "Takes some getting used to." She glanced at him, something unreadable in her eyes. "It's not the same kind of quiet." He understood what she meant. The silence she'd known before, the silence of captivity, of despair, had been heavy with fear. This silence, though vast, carried no threat. It was a silence where breath came easier, where shadows held no menace. "Out here," Clay said softly, "quiet means you survived another day." She looked back toward the horizon, the last light fading from the sky. For the first time since he'd brought her from that auction, she let out a long, steady sigh, not a sigh of defeat, but of release. The silence that followed was not empty. It was shared. And for both of them, it was the beginning of something they hadn't known in years, peace. By the time the first frost glazed the grass, the woman had begun to move differently around the ranch. Her steps were still cautious, but they carried less of the desperate edge of a cornered animal. She no longer hovered in doorways, waiting for permission. Instead, she drifted toward the barn in the mornings, lingered by the corral when Clay drove the cattle in, and sometimes sat on the porch in the evenings with her hands folded neatly in her lap, watching him mend tack or oil his rifle. She still hadn't offered her name. Clay never pressed her for it. A name would come when she was ready to give it, and forcing it would only make her retreat. For now, he thought of her only as the woman, though in quiet moments he sometimes caught himself wanting to call her something gentle, something that fit the way her eyes softened when the horses nosed her palm. What struck him most was how much she noticed. She studied everything, the way he coiled rope, the rhythm of his stride as he checked the fence line, the quiet signals he used to guide cattle from one pen to another. It wasn't idle curiosity. She was learning. Clay saw it in the set of her shoulders, the way she mirrored his actions when she thought he wasn't looking. One afternoon, while he wrestled a stubborn calf into place for branding, he turned to find her at his side, holding the branding iron steady. Her hands shook, but her eyes held determination. "I can do it," she said. Clay studied her a moment, then nodded and stepped aside. The hiss of iron on hide made her flinch, but she didn't pull away. When the calf bawled and bolted, she let out a shaky laugh, her first in his presence. The sound startled him more than the calf's kick. After that, she joined him more often. Not as a servant, not as someone bound, but as someone easing her way into life again. She carried buckets of water, stacked kindling, even tried her hand at mending fence wire. At first, her work was clumsy blisters raised on her palms, not slipped loose, but she didn't quit. Clay corrected her gently when she made mistakes, showing her the right way once and trusting her to learn the rest. At night, when they sat by the fire, the silence between them had changed. It was no longer wary or strained. It was companionable. Sometimes she asked questions, simple ones, about the ranch, about the cattle, about the weather. Clay answered with the patience of a man unused to speaking but willing to try. One evening, after a long day of hauling hay, she surprised him. "You don't ask about me," she said quietly, staring into the fire. Clay set down his mug. "Figure. You'll tell me what you want when you want." Her lips curved in something that might have been the faintest smile. "Most men wouldn't wait." "I ain't most men," Clay replied. She looked at him then, her eyes searching his face, and the flickering firelight. He thought she might finally give him her name, but instead she said, "I don't remember the last time someone let me decide anything." Her voice caught on the words, thick with memory. Clay didn't answer. He just stoked the fire, gave her space, and let the silence settle again. But in his chest, something shifted. He saw her not only as someone broken by cruelty, but as someone with strength buried beneath scars, someone who had survived when others might not have. In her own way, she began to see him too. She noticed how he paused by Mara's old chair at the table, how his eyes lingered on the empty space as though half expecting someone to fill it. She noticed the tenderness with which he treated the animals, how he talked to them in low murmurs, as if they were old friends. It became clear to her that Clay carried ghosts just as she did. His silence wasn't born of cruelty but of loss. His solitude wasn't a cage built for others, it was a cage he'd built around himself. And so, in the stillness of the ranch, two broken souls began to circle each other like wary animals in the wild, neither trusting fully, but neither walking away. They shared little more than work, meals, and silence, but in those simple things, a fragile bond took root. Clay didn't dare call it hope. Not yet. But one night, as he drifted toward sleep, he realized the house no longer echoed the way it used to. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was shared. And that made all the difference. The first snow had just begun to fall when the past came riding back. Clay and the woman she still hadn't given him her name were mending a section of sagging fence along the southern pasture. The air was sharp, breath hanging white in front of their faces, hands stiff inside gloves. She was crouched beside him, holding a post steady while he tightened the wire when the faint drum of hooves carried across the cold air. Clay froze. He knew that sound, riders, more than one, coming fast. He straightened slowly, eyes narrowing. At the horizon, sure enough, three figures emerged from the gray, their horses kicking up snow-dusted earth. The woman's grip tightened on the post. Her lips parted, breath quickening, and for a moment she looked as though she might bolt. But then her eyes flicked to Clay. He stood tall, one hand resting lightly on the fence wire, his other drifting near the rifle slung at his back. His face was calm, unreadable. Somehow that steadiness rooted her in place. The riders slowed as they reached the yard, their voices carrying before they were close enough to make out words. Clay recognized the scarred man from before, the one who tried to take her back. His sneer was colder this time, his eyes meaner. "Well, well," the man drawled, reining in. "Looks like you've been keeping her busy. Thought maybe you'd change your mind once the novelty wore off." Clay stepped forward, placing himself between the riders and the woman. "Told you before," he said, his voice even, "she's not yours." The scarred man leaned on his saddle horn, studying him. "See, that's where you're wrong. She belonged to the auction. That means she belonged to us. You think $1 makes her free? No, rancher. That $1 just means you bought the debt. And if you can't pay it proper, we'll collect her ourselves." The woman's breath hitched. Clay felt it like a knife to the gut, the way her body seemed to shrink behind him, bracing for betrayal. This was the moment, the test. Clay's voice dropped low. "Debt's paid. She stays." The men shifted, hands brushing their weapons. The scarred man spat into the snow. "You willing to die for her?" Clay didn't hesitate. "If that's what it takes." The silence that followed was sharp as ice. The woman stared at him, wide-eyed. She'd heard men swear promises before, but none had ever staked their life on her freedom. She wanted to believe him, but disbelief and hope warred inside her, tearing her in two. The scarred man finally barked a humorless laugh. "You're a fool, Harlow, but fine. Keep her. She ain't worth the trouble." He jerked his reins, turning his horse. "Winter's coming. Let's see how long she lasts in your care." The riders wheeled away, disappearing back into the gray horizon. The yard fell silent again except for the hiss of the wind. Clay let out a slow breath, then turned to face her. Her eyes were wet, though no tears had fallen. She searched his face as though trying to catch a crack, a tell, some sign that he hadn't meant it. But there was nothing, only the steady resolve of a man who had already buried one love and refused to let the world bury another soul in front of him. "You," she began. Voice breaking, she swallowed hard, tried again. "You would have fought them, for me," Clay nodded once. A man's word ought to mean something. For a long moment, she just stared at him, her lips parted, trembling. Then she turned away, pressing her hands to her face. The sob that escaped her was raw, unguarded. A sound of disbelief and release tangled together. Clay didn't move to touch her. He just stood beside her, letting her cry into the cold wind, his presence as steady as the earth beneath her boots. She finally lowered her hands. She whispered, "My name is Anna." The words hung in the air like a fragile gift. Her name, the one piece of herself she had kept locked away, safe from men who would twist it, break it, own it. And now, at last, she was offering it. Clay inclined his head, his voice soft. "Anna." The way he said it, no demand, no claim, just acknowledgement, made her chest ache. For the first time in years, she felt seen not as a debt, not as property, but as a person. It was only a beginning. But for two broken souls on a frozen plain, it was more than enough. Winter pressed down hard on the plains. Nights grew long and bitter, the kind where the wind howled through cracks in the cabin walls and the fire had to be fed constantly just to keep the frost from creeping inside. Clay was used to it. He'd weathered harsher winters before, but he worried about Anna. At first, she seemed almost brittle against the cold, thin frame wrapped in the coats and blankets he scrounged together for her. Skin pale, hands red and raw from carrying water or hauling firewood. Yet she refused to sit idle. The more Clay tried to shoulder the chores himself, the more she pushed back, insisting on helping. "I won't just be another mouth to feed," she told him one morning. Voice firm, though her body shivered in the icy dawn. And so they worked side by side. Clay splitting logs while Anna stacked them. Clay scattering feed for the cattle while Anna shoveled snow clear of the trough. Slowly she grew stronger. Her cheeks carried a hint of color, her steps more steady, her eyes less haunted. One afternoon the two of them were in the barn, patching a loose board where the wind had gotten in. Clay held the plank steady while Anna hammered the nails. She was clumsy at first, each strike too light or too wide, but her determination didn't waver. When she finally drove a nail straight, she let out a small gasp, half proud, half surprised. Clay chuckled, the sound rumbling low in his chest. "Told you, it's just practice." Anna glanced up at him, breath clouding in the cold air. And then, without warning, her lips curved. A smile. Not forced, not bitter, but real, hesitant and fragile, as though she'd forgotten how it felt, but real nonetheless. Clay froze, the sight hitting him harder than a kick from a mule. It was the first time he'd seen her face soften like that, the shadows lifting for even a heartbeat. His throat tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled inside him. All he could do was nod, as if to say, yes. Hold on to that. Anna looked away quickly, embarrassed, but the smile lingered for a few moments more before fading back into her usual guardedness. Still, Clay had seen it. And once seen, it could not be forgotten. That night, as they sat by the fire, Anna seemed different. She spoke a little more freely about the calf that had tried to chew on her coat, about how the snow glittered like glass in the morning sun. Her voice was still quiet, her words few, but there was a lightness there Clay hadn't heard before. At one point, when the fire popped and startled her, Clay teased gently, "You'll get used to it. This house likes to talk in winter." Anna laughed, not a full laugh, but a soft one, enough to make the room feel warmer. Clay found himself smiling too, a strange, almost forgotten stretch of muscles. Later, when she retired to her cot, Clay sat alone by the fire, staring into the flames. He thought of Mara, of the years of silence after she'd passed, of how he'd convinced himself joy was something he would never know again. And now here was this woman, scarred and broken, finding her first smile again under his roof. It humbled him. It scared him too, because with that smile came something dangerous, hope. The next morning, Anna surprised him again. She brought him a mug of coffee before he could pour his own. Her hands trembled slightly, but she set it down in front of him with care. "You work harder than anyone I've known," she said softly. "I thought you might like someone else to carry the load a little." Clay looked at her across the table, the steam rising between them. He wanted to tell her she'd already carried more than enough, that she didn't owe him anything, not a thing. But the look in her eyes stopped him. It wasn't obligation he saw there, it was choice. She was choosing to stay, to share, to give what little she could. And in that choice, in that smile the day before, Clay saw a truth clearer than anything. The vast plains could teach him. Anna wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to live. For the first time in years, so was he. By the time the snows began to thaw, the ranch had settled into a rhythm that felt almost natural. Days bled into one another, early mornings with steam curling from mugs, long hours of labor under the pale winter sun, evenings warmed by firelight and the soft cadence of two voices learning how to share silence without fear. Clay often caught himself marveling at how much had changed in so short a time. The cabin no longer echoed. Where once he'd trudged through the days with nothing but ghosts for company, now there was Anna, quiet, yes, still guarded at times, but alive in ways she hadn't been when he first brought her home. Her cheeks had color now. Her hands, though roughened by work, moved with certainty. She walked the ranch not like a prisoner in borrowed clothes, but like a woman testing her own freedom. One step at a time. And Claywell, he found himself changing too. He spoke more than he had in years. He laughed now and then, the sound startling even him. He'd always believed grief had carved him hollow, left no space for anything else. But Anna had shown him something he hadn't thought possible. Even hollow ground could grow again if given enough light. Spring came slow, but it came. The cattle grew restless in their pens, eager for fresh pasture. Birds returned to the skies. Anna began rising before Clay some mornings, already at work stoking the fire or carrying kindling when he stumbled sleepily into the main room. She moved with purpose now, as though she belonged. One evening, after a long day of repairing the north fence line, Clay returned to the cabin to find the table set. Anna had prepared stew from what little they had left in the pantry, thickened with beans and wild herbs she'd gathered herself. It wasn't much, but the effort spoke volumes. "You didn't have to," he said, setting down his hat. Anna shrugged, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Maybe I wanted to." They ate together in companionable quiet, the kind that needed no filling. At one point, Clay looked up to find her studying him with that same searching gaze she often wore, as if weighing something. When he raised an eyebrow, she hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever regret it, buying me that day?" Clay set his spoon down, meeting her eyes steadily. Not once. The words hung in the air, solid and certain. Anna lowered her gaze, blinking quickly, and for a moment he thought she might cry. But instead, she let out a breath that sounded more like release than sorrow. Later that night, as the fire burned low, Anna sat on the porch steps, wrapped in a blanket. Clay joined her, the boards creaking under his weight. The land stretched out before them, endless and quiet, stars pricking holes in the dark. "It's strange," Hannah murmured. "For so long I thought my life had ended, that there wasn't anything left for me but more of the same." Hurt chains, silence, and then she trailed off, pulling the blanket tighter. "Then you, $1. And suddenly, everything was different. Clay didn't know what to say. Words had never been his gift. Instead, he reached out slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, and rested his calloused hand gently over hers. She startled at first, then relaxed, letting their fingers intertwine beneath the blanket. For a long while, they sat like that, two broken souls stitched together not by grand gestures or fiery declarations, but by quiet acts of trust. Anna turned to him then, the firelight from the window catching her face, and she smiled again, soft, unguarded, the kind of smile that promised more. Clay felt something stir in his chest, something long buried. Not just the ache of remembering Mara, but the fragile bloom of possibility. He didn't fool himself into thinking wounds healed overnight. Both of them carried scars, some seen, some unseen. But he realized, sitting there with her hand in his, that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to live again, together. The ranch, once silent as a grave, now carried two heartbeats. And on that starlit porch, Clay understood. This was not an ending. It was the beginning.